WhatsApp's desktop vulnerability. The newly discovered PKFail exposes firmware to malware attacks. Malicious PyPy package targets macOS. Selenium greed crypto mining. Proofpoint settings exploited. Health equity data breach. Phishing campaign exploits Microsoft Office forms. Converting Outlook into a C2. All this and more in today's episode of the Cybersecurity Digest. Hello and welcome back to the Cybersecurity Digest, where our goal is to help you stay informed so you can stay secure. Today is Tuesday, July 30th, 2024, and this is our last episode of July. Hard to believe it is at the end of the month. You know what they say, time truly does fly. To our first-time listeners, welcome, and to my return listeners, welcome back. As always, I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to check out the show. If these episodes help you stay informed, I would greatly appreciate it if you would please share this show out with a colleague or someone you know who likes staying up to date on the latest cybersecurity news. Before we dive into today's topics, a quick reminder, our podcast is now released twice a week on Tuesdays as well as Fridays. With fewer episodes, we've divided the show into three main sections that will help you digest this content a little easier: notable news, prevalent patches, and our CISA Corner. I would love your feedback on the show, and in today's show notes, there is a survey that will help me know how I'm doing. If you could fill it out, I would greatly appreciate it. All right, everybody, time to dive into our first section, notable news. To kick off today's notable news section, we are going to take a look at a vulnerability that impacts Meta's messaging platform, WhatsApp. On Saturday, Bill Toulas with Bleeping Computer reported of the security issue that impacts the Windows version of the platform, which allows for sent Python and PHP attachments to be executed without warning when the recipient is opening them. Generally, these types of applications, when you're opening these types of files, there's some type of warning to the end user about the risk prior to proceeding. This is usually to help thwart uneducated users from opening unknown files. It is noted in the article that for this to be successful, Python does need to be installed on the machine. I personally don't know of many individuals outside of security, developers, and the IT space in general who would be running Python on their machines, but it is definitely something to be aware of. The article highlighted that the vulnerability was found by a security researcher while experimenting with file types that could be attached to conversation in WhatsApp. When the PHP and Python scripts are sent in a WhatsApp conversation, the user is presented with either an open or save as option. Bleeping Computer also tested other file types such as .exe, .vbs, .bat, .dll, as well as some other file types to reaffirm that this vulnerability is only applicable to PHP and Python scripts. This article did note that the security researcher, Satyajit Das, had reported it to Meta, but the issue was dismissed as not applicable. WhatsApp's stance is that users should avoid opening files from unknown sources regardless of the platform. Personally, while I agree with Meta that end users should not open items from unknown sources, I personally feel that they should resolve this, especially with the possibilities that could allow for this type of attack to propagate. If you would like to read the full report from Bleeping Computer, I have linked it in the show notes. I would love to hear your thoughts on this too. If you would like to share them, please leave a comment on the show's YouTube channel, Podbean, and Spotify comment should also be available now as well. Oh boy, this next one is quite interesting and, well, in my opinion, completely frightening. Binarily, a software supply chain security company, posted on Thursday about a newly discovered vulnerability they have dubbed PKFail. To quote the research from Binarily, PKFail is a firmware supply chain issue affecting hundreds of device models in the UEFI ecosystem. The problem arises from the secure boot master key, known as the platform key in UEFI terminology, which is untrusted because it is generated by independent BIOS vendors, IBVs, and shared among different vendors. This platform key, which manages the secure boot databases and maintains the chain of trust from firmware to the operating system, is often not replaced by OEMs or device vendors. This results in devices being shipped with untrusted keys. An attacker with access to the private part of the platform key can easily bypass secure boot by manipulating the key exchange key database, the signature database, and the forbidden signature database. PKFail represents yet another example of cross-silicon issue as it affects both x86 and ARM devices. The scope of this vulnerability was alarming to me, and several thousands of images are vulnerable to this vulnerability. These range from vendors from Lenovo, Dell, HPE, Supermicro, Intel, and many more. The research notes that the first firmware vulnerable to this issue was released back in May 2012. This vulnerability, if exploited, would allow for attackers to run untrusted code during the boot process. This even works around secure boot. This means that attackers could technically use this to install a UEFI bootkit. If you are unaware, a bootkit is an advanced rootkit that targets the master boot record located on the motherboard and loads during the boot process. The research notes that Black Lotus malware had been recently observed utilizing this type of malware. Binarily did a fantastic job with this research. They published several POCs on their website, a list of known vulnerable devices, as well as they have a tool where you can check to see if your motherboard is vulnerable to this. Highly suggest checking that out, also linked in the show notes. Alright, next up, if I have any developers listening out there who use macOS for Python development, you should be aware of a newly discovered malicious Python package. Checkmark's research posted on Friday of this newly discovered malicious package. The package, called lr-utils-lib, was published to PyPy last month, and it contains malicious code that executes upon installation. The research notes that the malware targets users' Google Cloud credentials, specifically those who have Macs. So if you're a Mac user out there who develops with PyPy, I've linked the research in the show notes for you to review the IOCs. That way you can check if you're impacted. Alright, moving right along here, Wiz Research on Thursday had identified an ongoing threat campaign named Selenium Greed that exploits exposed Selenium Grid services to deploy crypto miners. Selenium Grid, a component of the Selenium suite used for testing web applications, allows full interaction with the machines it runs on, including executing remote commands. This service is designed for internal networks and lacks default security controls, making it vulnerable when exposed to the internet. The threat actors leverage the Selenium WebDriver API to run Python with a reverse shell, deploying scripts that download a modified XMR rig miner. The research notes that they use various techniques to remain undetected, such as using compromised Selenium nodes as command and control, or C2, servers, and mining pool proxies. The miner is packed with custom UPX headers to help evade detection. The lack of default authentication in Selenium Grid services leads to many misconfigured instances being accessible to malicious actors. This poses a critical security risk, especially if the service is deployed on a publicly accessible node without stringent network security policies. Wiz Research notes that the campaign targets both older and newer versions of Selenium Grid with over 30,000 instances exposed to remote command execution. The attackers exploit the Chrome options class in Selenium WebDriver to set the Chrome binary path to Python, allowing the execution of Python scripts. They use base64 encoded payloads to create reverse shells and disable command logging. The attack process includes creating hidden scripts and using sudo commands to gain control over the machine. The miner communicates with servers controlled by the threat actors, dynamically generating pool IPs at runtime. When Wiz published the article, they stated that the threat actor is still active and believe it to be the first time this misconfiguration has been exploited in the wild. For a list of the steps you can take to help defend yourself and your organization, as well as IOCs, please check the show notes for the full article from Wiz Research. On Monday, July 29th, Proofpoint disclosed a recent spam campaign that exploited a configuration feature in Proofpoint's email infrastructure. In March 2024, Proofpoint researchers identified that spam was being relayed through a small number of their customers' email systems. This was due to a modifiable email routing configuration that allowed outbound messages from Microsoft 365 tenants to be relayed without specifying which tenants were permitted. This vulnerability was exploited by a single spam actor who used various Microsoft 365 tenants to send spam to users to free email providers like Yahoo, Gmail, and GMX. Proofpoint responded by implementing a streamlined administrative interface for customers to specify which Microsoft 365 tenants could relay messages, denying all others by default. They also mobilized a cross-functional task force to identify and contact at-risk customers, helping them change their configuration settings. This proactive approach included providing clear instructions, frequently asked questions, and product alerts to ensure customers could easily update their settings. Proofpoint's efforts were aimed at preventing further unauthorized relay abuse and protecting their customers from spam campaigns. I personally found it rather interesting that Proofpoint said that it was not attributable to a known entity and from a single actor. Proofpoint in their blog post stated that they will continue to share more information about these campaigns with others to prevent further abuse, as it is not unique to them. For a huge list of IOCs, as well as to read the full article yourself, you can find it in the show notes. Bleeping Computer reported on Monday that HSA provider Health Equity has determined the scope of a cybersecurity incident from earlier in July, and that number is 4.3 million impacted individuals. The attackers accessed the data using compromised credentials from a partner, leading to the exposure of sensitive information such as full names, home addresses, social security numbers, and payment card information. Health Equity has since secured the breach repository, terminated unauthorized sessions, and implemented a global password reset for the affected vendor. Bleeping Computer also noted that the victims will receive a 2-year credit monitoring and identity theft protection through Equifax. Health Equity advises impacted individuals to remain vigilant and review their account statements for any suspicious activity. Alright, moving right along here, Perception Point published last week of a newly identified phishing campaign. The article discusses a sophisticated 2-step phishing campaign that exploits Microsoft Office forms to steal Microsoft 365 credentials. Attackers create legitimate-looking forms embedded with malicious links and send them via email, often using compromised business partner accounts. This tactic, known as an external account takeover, enhances the credibility of the phishing attempt. The first step involves directing the user to a legitimate site like Office Forms, while the second step redirects them to a spoofed page designed to capture their credentials. The attackers use familiar icons and trusted URLs to make the fake pages appear genuine, increasing the likelihood of success. So please ensure your organization and coworkers are aware of this new technique. To read more about this technique from Perception Point, I've linked the article with their findings in the show notes. Alright, moving right along here. What would you do if I told you there is a new cross-site scripting vulnerability? Yeah, I can hear you groan and say, not again. Well, this next story, this is from Salt Security, and it definitely kicks things up a notch. Salt Security notes that cross-site scripting has long been recognized as a significant web vulnerability, consistently appearing in the OWASP top 10 list since 2004. Despite numerous protective measures, cross-site scripting remains a challenge due to its ability to execute JavaScript code on a victim's browser. Traditional cross-site scripting attacks involve injecting malicious scripts into web pages, which can steal sensitive information like cookies and credentials. Over the years, developers have implemented various defenses such as input sanitization, HTTP-only cookies, and content security policy to mitigate these risks. This article highlights that new technologies can sometimes revamp old vulnerabilities. A notable example is the combination of cross-site scripting with OAuth. The researchers demonstrated how an attacker could exploit the cross-site scripting vulnerability to read OAuth tokens from the URL. By starting a new OAuth login flow in a new window, the attacker could extract the OAuth credentials and achieve a full account takeover. This method bypasses traditional cross-site scripting protections like HTTP-only cookies. This article presents a case study involving Hotjar, a company that provides user behavior analytics for millions of websites. Despite Hotjar's adherence to the best practices for cross-site scripting prevention, researchers discovered a way to exploit cross-site scripting by leveraging OAuth. As stated in Salt's research, and I quote, due to the nature of the Hotjar solution, like recording user screen and keyboard activity, the data it collects can include a vast volume of personal and sensitive information, such as names, emails, addresses, private messages, banking details, and even credentials under certain circumstances, end quote. The article did state at the time of this recording, Hotjar did patch this vulnerability. If you'd like to read all of the amazing technical details, you can check out the full research article from Salt Labs, linked in the show notes. What if I told you that Outlook that you use for calendar scheduling, emails, can be used as a command and control server. Well, that's exactly what security firm TrustedSec published in a blog post yesterday of an internally developed command and control framework that they named Specula. In the blog post from the company, they highlight that with a few minor registry changes that change the behaviors of Outlook, this is possible. Despite being a known issue, this technique often goes unnoticed, providing attackers with persistent access to networks. This framework leverages the registry change vulnerability for initial access, aiming to raise awareness and help organizations develop preventative measures. Specula operates by exploiting the Outlook homepage feature, which was thought to be patched but still remains vulnerable to overlooked registry values. This allows attackers to run scripts within a privileged context, effectively turning Outlook into a command and control channel. Specula is designed to be easily extendable and automates the process of changing payloads, making it a powerful tool for continuous command execution. The article also outlines several mitigation strategies that you and your organization can take to prevent this. This includes using the new version of Outlook, removing the VB script engine and future Windows 11 versions, as well as configuring GPOs to disable WebView. Additionally, monitoring for specific registry key changes can help detect and prevent these attacks. TrustedSec, as mentioned previously, hopes that by releasing Specula, more attention will be brought to this attack vector, ultimately leading to it being remediated and closed off for good. If you would like, please find the article in the show notes. It is truly fascinating. They've done a lot of great work on this and definitely recommend checking it out. All right, our last story to round out our notable news section for today. We have a Tuesday blog post from Microsoft Security. Microsoft researchers have discovered a vulnerability in ESXi hypervisors. This is being tracked underneath CVE 2024-37085 that allows ransomware operators to gain full administrative permissions on domain-joined ESXi hypervisors. This vulnerability involves a domain group named ESXadmins, which grants full administrative access by default without proper validation. Microsoft disclosed this issue to VMware, which has since released a security update to address it. The article details how ransomware operators like Storm 0506, Storm 1175, Octotempest, and Manatee Tempest have exploited this vulnerability to deploy ransomware such as Akira and Black Basta. The attackers create the ESXadmins group and add a user to it, elevating their privileges to full administrative access on the ESXi hypervisor. This allows them to encrypt the file system, access hosted VMs, and potentially exfiltrate data, as well as move laterally within the network. Microsoft recommends that organizations using domain-joined ESXi hypervisors apply VMware's security update and follow Microsoft's mitigation and protection guidance to safeguard their networks. If you'd like to read this research, the mitigations, as well as a link to the patch from Broadcom for ESXi, those will all be in the show notes. All right, that wraps it up for notable news. On to Prevalent Patches. Last week, NVIDIA posted a security update patching their Jetson Linux. The vulnerability tracked as CVE 2024-0108 received a rating of 8.7 out of 10 and could lead to a denial of service, code execution, and escalation of privileges. Apple users, you might want to check to see if you have any updates today if you didn't already patch. Apple published numerous patches yesterday on Tuesday for Safari, iOS, and iPadOS, as well as macOS, watchOS, tvOS, as well as visionOS. So essentially all of their OSs have received some sort of patch yesterday for those that are still supported. If you are an Apple user, head into your settings and check to see if you have any updates available. Definitely patch if you do. And that concludes our Prevalent Patches section. On to our final segment of the show, our CISA Corner. CISA, or the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, has been busy since our last episode. They have published 3 new vulnerabilities to the Known Exploited Vulnerability Catalog, as well as 2 ICS advisories. Let's dive into those. The first 2 vulnerabilities from the Known Exploited Vulnerability Catalog that we're going to talk about are both related to ServiceNow. The CVEs for these vulnerabilities are CVE 2024-4879 and CVE 2024-5217. CVE 2024-4879 received a CVSS score of 9.3. To read the description from the National Vulnerability Database, it says, and I quote, "ServiceNow has addressed an input validation vulnerability that was identified in Vancouver and Washington, D.C. Now platform releases. This vulnerability could enable an unauthenticated user to remotely execute code within the context of the Now platform. ServiceNow applied an update to hosted instances, and ServiceNow released the update to our partners and self-hosted customers. Listed below are the patches and hotfixes that address this vulnerability. If you have not done so already, we recommend applying security patches relevant to your instance as soon as possible." End quote. On to the next ServiceNow vulnerability is CVE 2024-5217. This is the one that received a rating of 9.2 on the CVSS score. To quote the National Vulnerability Database for this one, it says, and I quote, "ServiceNow has addressed an input validation vulnerability that was identified in the Washington, D.C., Vancouver, and earlier Now platform releases. This vulnerability could enable an unauthenticated user to remotely execute code within the context of the Now platform. The vulnerability is addressed in the listed patches and hotfixes below, which were released during the June 2024 patching cycle. If you have not done so already, we recommend applying security patches relevant to your instance as soon as possible." Alright, last up in the CISA Known Exploited Vulnerability Catalog Editions is CVE 2023-45249, which scored a CVSS score of 9.8 out of 10 and impacts Acronis Cyber Infrastructure, ACI. The NVD states that remote command execution is possible due to the use of default passwords. Several versions of the product are impacted. To check out if your version is impacted, please check the link in the show notes. Alright, to wrap out our CISA Corner here, CISA released 2 industrial control system advisories since our last episode. The advisories are for Siemens SciCam products as well as Positron Broadcast Signal Processor. I'm not going to read the full advisories, but if you have either of those products, the advisories will be linked for you in the show notes. Alright, and that is going to conclude today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning into today's episode of the Cybersecurity Digest. As mentioned earlier, all links and articles mentioned in this show are in the show notes. Additionally, you can head to thecybersecuritydigest.com to find a link to find this show in your podcast platform of choice. If you like this episode, please consider sharing with someone you know who you think would like this show. Lastly, I would greatly appreciate it if you could leave this show a rating in your podcast platform of choice. As mentioned at the beginning of the show, in the show notes, you will find a form where I'm requesting your feedback. If you have a couple minutes and wouldn't mind filling that out, that will help me make this show better. Thank you again so much for your continued support. I greatly appreciate it, and it definitely keeps me going with this. All right, before I go, here is your Tuesday dad joke. I told my coworker I'd go the whole day without making any furniture puns. So far, so good. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. And until next time, stay informed to stay secure.